But hi, everyone. Welcome to our last session of this summer for Allies for Black Voices. We're really grateful to have everyone here. It's been a really great and informative summer, but I want to remind everyone, just because this is our last session of the summer, doesn't mean we don't all have a lot of listening and learning left to do. So I hope that you will all continue to reach out to us, as well as look through other resources from which you can learn. So it's my great pleasure today for me to introduce our panel speakers, Chief Brown and Loudoun County Commonwealth Attorney Buta, who is not here yet. But Chief Brown was appointed in 2016, and he's dedicated himself to the concept of service leadership and aims to make his department a hub for innovative policies. And Buta was elected as a Loudoun County Commonwealth Attorney in 2019 after having worked within the Virginia justice system. And having accomplished a lot of things, including her street law program. So before we begin, as always, I want to clarify that today's session will run as a panel, but there will be 10 to 15 minutes of open floor questions and answer at the end. You can drop your questions in the chat as we go, and then Chief Brown can choose to answer them as he goes or wait until the end, depending on what he's discussing. So I'm going to hand it off to Nikita. She's going to be asking a few of the questions. Yeah, thank you all for being here. All right, Nikita, floor is all yours.
Hi, I'm Nikita. So I wanted to first ask you if you wouldn't mind giving listeners like a short description of what your work entails, like what you do on a day-to-day basis, and like what the grand scheme kind of thing is overall in your work.
Okay, well, day to day, I oversee all of the general operations and administration of police and public safety services here in the town of Leesburg, which encompasses 12.8 square miles and serves a population of about 55,000 people with an unofficial daytime population. I may say unofficial because a friend of mine who is a demographer here for the county gave me these unofficial numbers, so I can't say they are official, but an unofficial daytime population of 100,000 plus. I'm proud to say that as of yesterday, or the day before yesterday, Council of Governments came out with their crime data report, and Leesburg is the safest community per capita in the National Capital Region. So I'm happy to be here. It's an opportunity. Again, this was a long time coming to get Leesburg to where it's at. It wasn't a dangerous community, but it wasn't always as safe as it is today, and probably one of the most desirable places to live in the Commonwealth. So I'm proud to be a part of not just a team here at LPD, but also proud to be a part of the community here and see us ushering in a new age, a new era of policing, despite the challenges that we are going through nationwide. I see those things as opportunities. I've been here serving the community roughly about 24 years in public service, and I've had a total of about 30 plus years in public service altogether. So been doing this for quite some time.
Thank you for sharing that. So our next question is going to be about like what you addressed already, like what's going on nationwide. So I wanted to ask you, has the Black Lives Matter movement influenced the way the Leesburg Police Department is run? Like, are there any specific demands on policing reform that have been integrated into department policies at all?
No, it hasn't. I always push people to engage their local police departments, because many of the things that was pushed forward through the movement and also through 8 Can't Wait and a number of different campaigns, we were already doing it. We pushed it out through the press. The media didn't pick up on it. It's funny how that works, isn't it? I'm not going to say the fake news stuff. I'm not going to say that, but I will say the news will pick and choose what they want to push forward in order to get the most clicks, the most likes, the most views. And I get it. They are a business, and they're a business of news. So we control our own message through social media. I have my MPO, Drogan, I have my PIO, MPO Drogan, put that out on our social media web platforms. I did a full presentation to a number of different groups. I also put the press release out, and I also did a presentation to our council. Many of the policies that have been being pushed forward as a result of this current Black Lives Matter movement, because I say current, this has been going on for quite some time. Many of those policies, we've been doing them for decades here. Many of those policies in Northern Virginia, I'm happy to say I helped write throughout my assignments, not just here at Leesburg, but with the county, and also as Deputy Director of Basic Training for 17 of our member agencies at our local academy. So, you know, again, when we don't engage our local police, besides in times of crises, we don't know these things. Most people don't want to engage us, but it's quite the opposite for us. We want our public to come and talk to us and ask us what it is we're doing and how it is that we're doing it. And we want to hear from them. Unfortunately, that does not happen until something like George Floyd happens. So to answer your question, has the Black Lives Matter movement influenced anything that we do here? Absolutely not, because we've been doing it anyway. So, you know, the only thing I will say that I did change was and I didn't change it, duty to intervene policy. So we've had a duty to intervene policy for as long as I can remember. And the way that policy read, just to paraphrase it, was any officer or staff member of the police department who observes immoral conduct or behavior that is not befitting the mission and vision of this agency is duty bound to report that. We already had that policy in place. I then changed it and worked along with our town attorney to actually use the words duty to intervene. And not only did I enhance the language in that particular policy, but I also gave a step-by-step for the officer or staff member to take. So we're actually training them. If you observe this, this is what you do. If you observe this, this is what you do. But we are all duty bound to report immoral conduct, excessive force being utilized, or anything that would jeopardize us meeting our mission and vision here, or jeopardizing our integrity, or our standing in the community. So again, we already had the policy. I would say if there's anything that I got out of Black Lives Matter movement, was I took that duty to intervene and actually utilize that language.
Thank you for sharing. I did want to ask, because my next question was actually directed towards Buta, I did want to ask you real quick. You mentioned that you guys had already implemented a lot of the policies that are being pushed for right now, especially like the 8 Can't Wait. I actually noticed that on the Facebook page for the Leesburg Police. Do you mind quickly explaining like what exactly those policies are, beyond what you've already explained?
As far as the 8 Can't Wait policies, I'd have to pull them up verbatim, but essentially all 8 Can't Wait policy. I'll focus on the duty to intervene. I've talked about that one. Shooting at moving vehicles. Again, as long as I can remember, we couldn't shoot at moving vehicles unless, of course, your life is in jeopardy. And what happened with that particular policy was some officers, not in this jurisdiction, were purposely placing themselves in harm's way. So that bravery, that courage takes over, and next thing you know, you're stepping in front of the car like the movies. We don't train like that. We train to get out of the way of the moving vehicle, because what you're essentially doing is, if you step in front of that vehicle, you have actually elevated yourself to the use of deadly force. So for us, we train never to put yourself in harm's way. We are never to be directly in front of the vehicle or directly in back of the vehicle. You're always to be to the side of the vehicle in such a position where you can move away from the vehicle in case it starts to move. Sometimes that's not happening. Sometimes the officer is actually reaching in the car to try to stop, the person from driving away. That happens very rarely, but can happen in the heat of the moment. But we never tell an officer or train an officer to place themselves in harm's way by getting in front of a vehicle or to the rear. So that kind of alleviated that issue, but we've had that policy forever. As far as, give me a few more that were on there. So you had the duty to intervene, shooting at a moving vehicle.
So I have the graphic up right now, and a few of them say like ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation.
All right, yeah, let's go one by one. Ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Again, our policy prohibited chokeholds. There were some agencies that allowed chokeholds throughout the United States. They were very rare, but I could tell you here in Northern Virginia, that was something that we did years ago. I've been a cop since 1996. And I have never been, and again, very involved in the academy. was the Deputy Director of Basic Training, 2013 to 2015. Not part of what we train to do. So that's been banned.
Right. So our next one's going to be requiring de-escalation.
Yeah, that's an oldie but goodie. Again, as long as I can remember, we've been utilizing that. Now, of course, within the last 10 years, that has escalated. I'll even say beyond that. I'll say that when the county first started moving towards crisis intervention training back in 2008, 2009. And the reason why I know that is because I was deeply involved in that whole process in the very beginning. In 2010, I was assigned to field operations after being on the task force for 8 years. Because what we were noticing is from 2007 to 2010, we saw an increased amount of contacts with individuals suffering from mental crises. And these individuals were ending up in the judicial system when they should have been ending up going to get services for mental health. So I started tracking those numbers and worked with staff to come up with the first gamut of crisis intervention training. And then, of course, when my old boss, because I was with the sheriff's office for 20 years, Sheriff Chapman came in, he enhanced the program even further. During that time, we started utilizing de-escalation techniques. Prior to that, it's always been de-escalation techniques. The old use of force continuum that we used to use allowed for de-escalation, but it was a use of force continuum, meaning that everything was in like a kind of like a ladder. So you had officer presence or command presence, then you had verbal commands, then you had hands-on tactics or control tactics, then you had use of OC spray or baton, and then you had use of firearm. Of course, over time, you had to put the taser in there, along with other means. But what we found with that training is that somebody like me, I'm going to be able to come from having my weapon out, seeing the individual de-escalate, and seeing the individual comply. I'm able to come straight back down to verbal command. So I'm able to come off my weapon, reholster my weapon, and maybe go to OC spray or my ASP. What we're finding in the training is some individuals, because of the amount of excitability, the adrenaline rush, they were having a hard time coming down from here. And so when other individuals started de-escalate, they would still be up here, or they would come down one notch. That's still not the appropriate amount of force. You should be back down here. So what we did was we changed the use of force continuum, which I think is also another question there. And our use of force continuum now is a circle with the officer here. So say if you do have your weapon out and the individual immediately complies and gets on the ground, you can come straight back down and go straight to verbal commands or hand control tactics. So we changed that use of force continuum, I'm gonna say about 10 years ago. So once again, far ahead of probably the rest of the nation. And the reason why, and I'll say that, I'm not bragging about Northern Virginia because we're the best thing since sliced bread. I think we are well positioned and located right in our nation's capital. We have a lot of resources. We have a lot of networking. We have a lot of training academy. We're right here next to DC. And we have a very good relationship with all of the DMV law enforcement agencies. Plus, all of our think tanks are here. Police Executive Research Forum, which led the way in re-engineering police use of force back in 2015 to complement President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. We have ICP, International Association of Chiefs of Police, a great resource for model policies. We have NOBLE, which I'm a member of all three of these, by the way, which is National Organization for Black Law Enforcement Executives, which touch on justice through action and equity within policing. So we have all of these think tanks right here in our region, which help us develop our policies, help us look at how we hire individuals, and give us the academic resources we need to be a little bit further ahead than most of the other regions in the country. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I did want to ask something that you mentioned just briefly. establishing the use of force continuum. I'm actually not familiar with what that is. Would you mind explaining what force continuum is?
Well, the use of force continuum is a training model or training method used to train police officers to use the appropriate force in relation to the amount of resistance that a suspect is presenting. So if a suspect is mouthing off, or I won't say that, if a suspect has a knife, you need to have the appropriate level of force in order to address that issue. So if a suspect has now dropped the knife, you need to now, and moved away from the knife, you need to now be able to de-escalate through the use of force continuum to address that issue with the appropriate amount of force to stop the resistance or make the arrest. So essentially, that's what the use of force continuum is. We don't use that continuum anymore. We use a use of force model now, which is that circle I described, which you'll have the officer in the middle, you'll have verbal communication or verbal commands, you'll have command presence, use of your collapsible baton, OC spray, taser, firearm, so forth and so on. So we've actually changed it from a continuum, which was a ladder step, ladder approach, to a circle, which allows you to de-escalate a lot more quicker.
Okay, thank you. So do you want me to keep going through some of the other requests?
If you guys are curious, I've told you that basically all of our policies superseded them, but if you guys want more information in detail, to fill some time until Beauty gets on here, I'm all for that too. So,
would you actually mind if I switch to a slightly different question? Because I know that there are questions in the chat and we have used for a limited amount of time today.
Oh, I didn't even see. Let me go down. I'm still getting used to this Zoom stuff, so you guys have to bear with me, all right?
Absolutely. Here, I can read the questions out loud because we record the sessions. So from Jessica Berg, we have a question saying, are there other areas in the Commonwealth that you think could benefit from the policies you've implemented for years and learn from your experiences?
Well, I won't necessarily say that because in order for you to know what's going on in a different jurisdiction, you have to be there. I have my hands full right here in Leesburg. So, although I get news from other areas here in the Commonwealth from other departments, I don't know the intricacies of the issues and, revolving around those issues. So I don't speak on that. I think we as Americans have gotten too much into applying opinion when we don't have all the facts. I've always strayed away from that, particularly as an administrator of justice. That can get you hemmed up. So for me, I may hear certain things, but I don't know what their policy is. I don't know the intricacies of the situation, of facts of the circumstances. So, unless I'm brought in as to do a desk review, for instance, last month or month before last, I was asked to do a desk review for some Richmond policies. But with that process, I would have been privy to all of the facts of the situation or the case. Absent that, I don't opine on anything of that nature. I can only speak for Leesburg, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It looks like we've got questions flooding in. So then from Sophia, we have a question that goes, do you have any data on the use of force incidents by the police department? And I'm assuming you're referring to Leesburg.
By this police department?
Yes, I believe the question is referring to Leesburg, but Sophia, if you'd like to clarify, please feel free.
So we do track use of force, but they're so minimal that they're really not even reportable. And use of force for us, I actually track when a weapon is drawn. So anytime an officer draws his weapon and points it at somebody, we classify that as a use of force. And you might ask, well, even if he reholsters it, nothing ever happens. You might ask why? Why do you track that? Because if I see a pattern of an officer constantly drawing his firearm, to me, that's a red flag on maybe a training deficiency. Maybe there's something else going on in an officer where he has a heightened level of anticipation. So that allows me to address that issue immediately through the collection of data. Our use of forces, and we don't even call it use of force, we call it response to threats, response to resistance and threats. And the funny thing about that, that policy was written in 2015. I wasn't here, but guess who helped write that policy? Yours truly, because I was assigned to the academy as deputy director. Myself, along with the director, assisted Chief Price, the chief at the time, to write that policy. Then we were moving away from even the wording of use of force. So we were very progressive even back then. And Chief Price is actually, response to threats and resistance, actually, you might say it's semantics, but I think a lot of times words are very powerful. And use of force is something that we use for so long, when it wasn't typically a use of force, it was our response to threats and risk. So we don't even call it that particular policy. We don't even call it use of force anymore. We call it a response to threats and risk, resistance.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, I believe, again from Jay Berg. We have our team actually has a very similar question, so I'm going to combine the two. So our team's question was, there are obviously a lot of concerns about how we as a nation will proceed in the future, especially in regards to policing. The two biggest solutions that have been offered up are police reform and defunding of the police. What are your thoughts, and do you have one that you support, and why?
I'm always for police reform. I've been involved in police reform probably since I became an administrator. I don't even say before that, since I became a supervisor. One of the first units I was assigned to when I first put the stripes on, which is a sergeant, was our vice and narcotics unit. They sent me over there because they were absent policy and procedure, and they got the job done, but they got the job done probably in ways that they shouldn't have. So they sent me over there basically to, number one, be the supervisor, operationally, administratively, to grow the unit, to be more effective, and to create policy which governed how the unit actually operated. I said earlier that I went in as a sergeant, came out as a captain. I think I might have said, I was on a Zoom earlier, so it might have been on that one. Over a course of 8 years, from 2002 to 2008. There's a reason why they kept me there that long. It's because we were doing so many good things. There was a time when internal affairs investigations out of that unit, I mean, it was almost every other week. While I was there, we had none. We had no injuries. Only injuries we had to detectives were two pre-existing medical issues that occurred. Procedurally, we were never sued. The 8 years I was there. And we grew the unit from 6 people, including myself, to 23 when I left, and were quite effective throughout the region. So I say that to say this, that took reform to go over there, straighten up a unit that was only a few years beyond several indictments, by the way, in the late 90s, and to essentially still meet measurable success without any issues. Did we have minimal, minor issues, personnel issues? Yes, we did. But we had nothing to the level that was occurring in prior years. So reform is always in policing. And I constantly have to tell folks, and I did say this on an earlier Zoom I was on. When I first got into law enforcement, I'll say this, when I first went to the county, we had roughly about, our manual was only about 200 and some pages. When I left there in 2016, it was 1,022 pages. That's reform. That's identifying issues within policing and developing policies to address those particular issues. So for me, in certain regards, I've been in police reform, probably as long as I've been a supervisor, but really deep in reform on the regional level since being assigned to the academy in 2013, where I was involved in several different fact-finding and policy missions by some of the agencies here in Northern Virginia in order to get better, in order to train better, in order to hire better. So police reform is an ongoing thing. And even beyond this, it will continue to develop. Defund the police. Most people who use that term have no clue what it even means. And what we've done is we've taken a blanketed, cliche catchphrase that just seems popular to talk about and apply it to 800,000 police officers and 18,000 different agencies with varying degrees of hiring and training and accountability. And that I will say, and I've actually said this several times, I think for anybody in a position of influence, it's irresponsible to blanketly and broad brush those types of things on every single police officer. And I challenge folks that say stuff like that, you know, doctors, and if there's any doctors on here, I'm sorry, but doctors are by far responsible for more deaths than police officers. Absolutely. Across the board. But you're not going to go to stop seeing a doctor, right? No, you're not. If something's wrong with you, you're going to go to the doctor. We have a very small percentage of individuals that unfortunately taint the badge. And our profession is probably the only profession on the face of the earth, on the globe, that where a person can do something 800 miles away and a community can look at, or members of the community can look at their local police department who have no record or no history of doing anything to that degree and say, all cops are bad. We're the only profession. And it's been that way for years. So defunding the police, when people say that, they have no idea what that even means half the time. Somebody asked me a few weeks ago, about what my thoughts were on defunding the police. Defunding the police is not going to work. I'll say this, my response, and this was an elected official, policing is doing way more than it was ever designed to do in the first place. We are not just police officers, but we are mediators, we're zoning officers, we're social workers, we're teachers, we're coaches, and we're parents half the time, because if you guys knew what kind of calls we respond, because people can't properly parent, you sit back in your seat. When you're calling us because your kid won't go and clean the basement up. That's not our job, but that's what we've been tasked to do. And here in Leesburg, we have a phrase, call a cop, get a cop. Even if it's a civil matter, we come in and we act as mediators. So when you talk about defunding the police, you're talking about, essentially, the bottom line is just the funding needs to remain the same. The responsibilities and duties need to be taken away and given to those entities within our government who is responsible for it. And I won't name the individual departments, but many times, and I can tell you, even as a patrol officer, when I called a particular department at a particular time at night, they didn't come out. So guess who got stuck handling the problem? So when you talk about defunding the police and reallocating funds, maybe in some jurisdictions that might work. But again, applying that blanketly across 800,000 police officers and 18,000 agencies is asinine and ridiculous to me. And I actually said that in front of council. It's asinine. Most people who say that do not even understand the dynamics of governance, nor do they understand the intricacies of policing and what it is that we do out here. Am I all for having a conversation about what I call government accountability? Absolutely. Absolutely. Would I like to have access to a mental health worker at 3 a.m. like that, Johnny on the spot, to help us deal with individuals suffering from mental crises? Absolutely. Is that what we get? Is that what we see in my profession, in my 24 years experience? Absolutely not. You get an on-call person. We're the only ones out there 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And that's what I don't think, that's why I think people say that, but they don't understand. And I've had, I don't even know how many conversations over the last few months in reference to this. And I will tell you this also, I don't have statistics on this, but a majority of the individuals that I've had conversations with, I've asked them, have you ever been victim to a violent or serious crime? And what do you think the overwhelming answer is? No. So it's very easy for somebody that has not had to use these services to say those type of things. But tell that to someone who has suffered from a serious injury from a spouse, from a car accident, a debilitating car accident, or a child who's in need of services because their parents are neglecting them. Try telling that to those individuals who have been rendered those services, and they might think a little bit differently. And I get a little passionate about that because, again, we're very easy to put catchphrases on things that we're not familiar with. And we do that as a society. And they actually make our job as peace officers very difficult. 40% of my agency is below the age of 40. Very young here, very young. And when they're out there trying to do the right thing and trying to do, trying to help people, and belong to an agency that actually has a good reputation like ours, but you're painted with this broad brush, doesn't bother me because I've been in the game for a long time and I got thick skin. But you can imagine what it does for our recruiting and recruiting good people, people who actually want to do the job. And most people don't want to do this job because of things of that nature. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Chief Brown, for answering. I wanted to mention to everyone that Buta entered the room. Buta, it's great to see you. I hope court was okay and not super stressful today, but I'm sure it is every day. So we only have Officer Brown here for a few more minutes. So I did want to combine two questions in the chat here. One is from Joshua about the intersection of your racial identity with your position as police chief. He's wondering if it's influenced how you police your community. And then I believe Monica's question is about who gets to determine if an officer's life is threatened enough to call for a physical altercation. So I'll let you start with the intersection of your racial identity. And I actually wanted to extend that to Buta, to ask her if she thinks her racial identity as a woman of color has impacted how she goes through the legal system. Okay. I hope that was actually impact.
Who you want to go first?
Oh, that's up to both of you. I know, Officer Brown, you only have a few more minutes, but.
I'll go ahead and go first. First of all, Buta, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Chief. Good to see you always. Thank you. Sorry to be late, everybody.
Hey, duty calls, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will say this, and I say this often, anybody who came to my investiture, my swearing in, it was 2016, which was on the tail end, of course, of Ferguson, Michael Brown, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. It was on the tail end of all of that stuff. And when I gave my speech, not as a black chief, but I gave my speech as a chief that happened to be black. So I say that to say this, that I made no mention of race in my speech whatsoever, because we had enough of that around us. My focus is on ensuring that everybody that was there and everybody that was in the community that I will be serving knew that they will be served objectively, impartially, and fairly across the board, regardless of their race and regardless of my race. And that is the role, that is the true role of policing today in the 21st century. Is that what we're seeing in certain parts of the country? No, it's not. Do we have more work to do? Absolutely, we do. Do I believe that there was an intersection which caused me to be able to serve the way I do now? Absolutely. Which carved out my career path? Absolutely, because I can tell you, my father did not want me to be a police officer. My father did not want me to be a police officer because of the images he saw from the rural South, working in cotton fields in Georgia, the son of a sharecropper, and the grandson of a slave. That makes me the great-grandson of a slave. And the images he saw growing up in the 50s and the 60s during the civil rights movements of police were not good. Hoses, dogs, batons, sticks, and jail cells. So when he started to realize this guy seriously wants to be a cop, because I wanted to be a cop ever since I was little. He had a hard time with that. Of course, now through his maturity and through mine, he now sees that it was a necessity for me to be involved in policing, and not as a detective or a SWAT team member or a jump team member, just not as a sergeant or lieutenant, but actually as the CEO of a progressive forward-leading agency, which, by the way, happens to lead the region in community policing. So for me, my path was carved out for me through my experiences with policing or with police, which wasn't always positive. My early on experiences with cops was great. When I grew a mustache and my voice went octaves deeper and I grew over 6 feet tall, it changed. It changed even more when I started driving. That also pushed me to be involved and become a part of the solution and be a part of changing a system which was born out of racism. We all know that. We all know that. And nobody denies that at all. But I knew what I had to do. I knew eventually that I would maybe not end up as chief, but that I would end up in a role in which I could be a better influence, which early on was the training side. I teach a course down at the Academy right now since 2015 called Serving Diverse Communities. And it touches on implicit biases and how we can be aware of those implicit biases so it does not affect how we serve the communities. And we live in one of the most diverse communities in the nation. And we put that course together back in 2015. I've taught every single recruit since 2015 to present. I actually teach next week. I teach a class of about 80 recruits down there next week. So yes, it did define my career path. It defined who I am today as a public safety official. And it also strengthened my passion and resolve to ensure that everybody in this community, in any community that I serve, gets treated fairly, objectively, and impartially. And I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And then Buta, I was actually wondering, so I was actually there when you first ran, which was a delight. And I'm wondering how that has impacted, your work right now in the legal system. I mean, working in Loudoun County, it's a big place.
I am going to tag a lot with what Chief Brown was saying, and I'm just going to add my little flavor to it. For starters, when he was talking about us being a very diverse community, it's interesting because in my mind's eye, we are not diverse enough. And to, credit to his statement, we are a very diverse community, but to a certain degree, our differences sometimes are not allowed to shine. Rather, it feels like within our community, we have differences, but we all try to just melt together too much so that sometimes we lose our identity. We're not allowed to express ourselves in the way that we feel our community is going to be receptive. So I'm going to go back a little bit as to my growing up. My parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Albania. It's a country that, we have like maybe, 48 states that are larger than the whole daggone country. So you have that part. They emigrated to Yugoslavia, which now is Montenegro. And that's where I was born with 7 of my 8 siblings. And we came to Bronx, New York when I was 2.5 years of age. We grew up in predominantly African-American communities. And we use the phrase right now when we start talking about having some sort of insight into race, where sometimes you'll hear somebody say that they don't see color. I tell everybody this: I saw color, I just didn't see my color, because I was so well received by our community that I never thought, and they never treated me as being someone that was outside of their community. We didn't have that kind of difference because everybody was struggling to survive, to have food on the table, to make sure that there was a roof over their heads, and whatever kids they had were safe. So everybody had the same similar basic struggles that we really didn't look beyond that. I mean, we didn't judge ourselves based on means because nobody had means. I mean, we kind of just, did day-to-day survival. So that's kind of by way of my background as to what brought me into the law. I actually might have been one of Chief Brown's obviously I'm a little bit older than he is, so probably I wouldn't have been one of his hirees, but I could have been in that profession. Had I been younger than him, I might have worked with him. Where I did see law enforcement as being a great way to help and contribute to our community. But the negative experience that I had was growing up in the 70s and 80s in New York. It was a really tough time. We had a lot of high crime, and law enforcement really was very aggressive towards the general population, and especially being a kid, you're very much into what's black and white, what is wrong and what is right. And if law enforcement steered from that where we perceived them to be a bit more aggressive than the situation warranted, then we held it against everybody. So now you fast forward, I don't know, is this 3-4 decades later, where we're similar. A lot of things have not changed. And I would suggest this, that there's nothing that pisses me off more than an officer who violates their badge. There is one thing that pisses me off more, and that is an attorney who violates their integrity and their ethics, because it makes us all look bad. So when law enforcement talks about we shouldn't be using the same brush to paint them all, that's exactly 100% correct. The majority of our law enforcement officers are dedicated to the job. They're dedicated to their ethics. They're dedicated to doing the right things for our community. And when we have one or few more kind of go astray, it should offend the entire community, including law enforcement. Because what it does is then it makes it harder for those who are the good police officers to do their job, because they don't get the benefit of the community support. They don't get the benefit of somebody looking at what they're doing and saying, you know what, thank you very much. We're all kind of looking at them saying, okay, now, who's going to be the next one that runs rogue? And that's not fair to them. And it's not fair to our community, because it creates further division. And that's where right now is a really tough time for us as a community member to be. And I don't want to sound, I'm going to use Chief Brown's other word, asinine, in saying this, but it actually is a good time, because we now have the conversation that everybody is having it at the breakfast table, at the, water cooler. Well, we don't have parks anymore because we're all under COVID lockdown, but, wherever we were hanging out, that's the conversation that people are having legitimately. What is wrong with how things are done? And most importantly, how do we make that change? Because we've always been shocked before. We've always been mortified as to what we saw. And our feelings got hurt, and we knew it was wrong, and then we stopped talking about it. We're not talking about it anymore. We're all willing to do something now. And we look at it from within our court system. We look at law enforcement, and Chief Brown is one of now what's coming out to be many law enforcement officers who are willing to say, you're right. These are the changes that we need to do. With Chief Brown's agency, this is not something that they just woke up to after Minneapolis. This is something that they've been doing for years and years. But now this has become a common conversation with other law enforcement chiefs to say, you know what, this is our duty and our obligation to the community to make sure that we're doing right. And I don't know, I won't speak for him or anybody else in law enforcement, but I don't know anybody in law enforcement who sits there and cheers when somebody who's wearing a uniform does something bad. I don't know anybody that. And I'm not being polite about it. I just think that it actually offends them more than if it's possible to offend us as a community. So, when we bring these experiences and this aspect of what we're seeing, and we're in positions where we can make and effect change, it's daunting. It's a bit overwhelming. And it's probably the most amazing opportunity I've ever had in my life. So it's all those mixed emotions, right? Crazy amongst crazy, and you're just like, holy shucks. But it's a great time right now to be able to have this conversation, because when we're talking with everybody in the community, everybody's saying, what do we need to do to change? And they're willing to roll up their sleeves, get, sweaty and be able to say, okay, how do I now do this? And that's the exciting part as to where I find myself with after the elections. As was mentioned, I've only been a prosecutor and the Commonwealth's attorney, the chief prosecutor, since January 1st. We had, 3 months in it, and then COVID hit, and as I said before, crazy got crazier, but it's still an exciting time for us to be able to try to effect whatever change we can in our communities. to be better and to do better and expect better and demand better. These are things that we can hold one another accountable for that. So we've all got some good ideas that we want to push through, and we definitely need the support of our community to make it happen, because ideas are great, but they're not a damn thing until somebody starts walking the walk. So that's a long-winded answer. Sorry, Chief.
No worries. I'm going to have to cut out, folks. Buta, always enjoy the partnership. Folks,
Thank you.
have one of these in the future. I almost speak for Buta. I'm pretty sure she'll sign on anyway because that's what she does. But if you have one of these or you want to do a series 2 or whatever, feel free to reach out to MPO Drogan. I'm always open to these. I feel that every single interaction is an opportunity to provide a perspective that may have been otherwise unknown. So I always welcome those things. I don't run from them at all. And as you guys can see, I don't run from the hard questions either. So please feel free. And even if there's questions beyond this conversation Zoom, send them to MPO Drogan and we'll try to get you an answer.
Thank you, Chief.
All right. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for the invitation. Everybody be safe and be well and stay healthy.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
So, Buta, so you mentioned COVID, and that was a question I had prepared for you. Obviously, in the past couple of months, it feels like the world has, turned upside down with COVID, with, the civil rights crisis we have and the economy. And so I was just wondering, how has life and your career and just things in general, how has it changed for you in the past couple months? What is different? What is the same? And how has all of this impacted you in your career?
So let's put this number out there now. I am 56. You ain't got that much daggone time in life for me to answer this question. So I'm going to try to answer what I can. Okay. But if I don't answer what you want to hear, then you got to hold me to it.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to speak to it from a professional perspective. Add COVID to the fact that this is a new position for me. I was a defense attorney for 27 years. I also had been blessed with having an opportunity to be a sub-judge for about 11 years as part of that role. So my life was really different. Then I get this genius idea that I want to be a prosecutor so we can make the change from within the system. And so that by itself made things crazy because I was now in a situation, instead of helping individuals one-on-one, the task that I undertook was to be more global about that, and global being throughout Loudoun County. And that was a significant undertaking. So now we were in a situation where I'm trying to effect policy, work with the different agencies so that they can see things a little bit differently. So it's not just purely punitive, but it's much more engaging in our community so that our communities are safe. And safety comes from a whole spectrum of what that means for people. Safe from being a victim, safe from the system victimizing you, safe in the sense that we all know that if we are charged or we need law enforcement, that they're going to serve us appropriately. So safety has taken a much broader meaning for me. Going to court is something that for COVID, we pretty much almost shut down in the month of March. April, we opened up a little bit more. And when I say almost shut down, it's because for emergency cases and arraignments where people are apprised of what their rights are, court was still open for those types of matters. But as far as having regular trials, we didn't have that. Our juvenile courts and general district courts, which deal with misdemeanors and felony preliminary hearings, those have been pretty much opening up more. Right now, we're about, I want to say, if not 100%, we're very close to 100% being open. Our circuit court, which deals with jury trials, not happening. We right now are working on a task force to try to figure out a system that we could have jury trials. So the challenge is we have victims who, from many angles, need to have their day in court, as do the accused. They need to have their day in court. And what we have right now is we don't have that opportunity. And we may have people who are locked up or people who are at liberty, but their life can't move on. So this COVID crisis really has just upended our whole system. And we're just trying to figure out how to navigate it. From a personal perspective, I am one of 8 kids, as I mentioned. I have 19 nephews and nieces. I have 17 great nephews and nieces, and we're a very large family. I host Thanksgiving every year, and we start out with a count of 70 and work up. So I am very family centric and friends and stuff like that. Not having that ability to have real contact with people, I tell you what, it freaks people out from a sense of community that you don't have that human contact. Zoom is awesome. However, no offense, it's not the same thing as sitting down at a table with a cup of coffee. It's not the same. And then you throw in the physical contact that you can't hug people like you might used to be able to do. And now you're like, I don't know if I could shake your hand. Do I wave? Do I touch an elbow? I don't know. What do we do? So those are things that I think have just really affected us in a way that we just don't know how to act, because this is really some friggin' weird times. And it affects everybody differently. In my office, I call it whiplash. Where you have on one side of the spectrum, somebody's like, oh, this COVID, it's a cold, no big deal. You sniffle, you sneeze, you move on. And then the other part of the spectrum is like, oh my God, we're all gonna die. And everybody's entitled to their appropriate, thoughts and emotions. And you can't tell somebody that's extreme in either direction. So it's affected our relationships even within the office. We're a young team, but we haven't had the ability to have the in-person contact consistently so that we can learn more about each other, figure out what our strengths are, where we can support each other. So that's another area that COVID has definitely jacked us up, but we're working through them. And thank you for the question, Grace.
Thank you for the answer. Did we want to move into, let's see, I think we've got a couple questions in the chat, so I think we can shift into that. So Pooja asked, in both the justice system and law enforcement, there are clear issues with racial profiling and racially biased decisions. Not every police system is as progressive as the ones in Leesburg. How do you as a public figure ensure that the progress doesn't stop? And how do we spread what we know here to other police departments and legal systems across the country?
Okay, so let's just talk about the legal system in Loudoun. We're not perfect, and we're not close to perfect. And I will say this not from a bad place, but every community is one incident shy of being Minneapolis, right? Because if we see injustice like that, I can't say to you that we would not, as a community, not react as aggressively, because we too would be like, what the hell is going on? How does this happen in our community? So I don't operate from a place of fear. I operate from a place of anticipation. So what I do, especially in my position right now as a Commonwealth attorney, I am anticipating that when the time comes that we have to deal with something like that, how are we going to respond? And the way that we do that is by keeping our system in check now to make sure that we do everything that we can so that we don't become that next Minneapolis, that we don't have a George Floyd amongst our contact with law enforcement. With that, we have a duty to our community to do that. And how we do it, and we've made this a policy in my office, is if there's, and I'm sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. We have body cameras on maybe about 45 of our sheriff's deputies. And on Chief Brown's team, I think they have about 100. But that's like about 150 body cameras that are on a law enforcement force that we deal with that's a little bit under 1,000. That's not a whole lot of body cameras, and they're not enough of them to protect the law enforcement officers as well as the citizenry. But our policy in our office is this: if there is any contact between a law enforcement officer and a civilian that exceeds my putting my hands on you to put on handcuffs, that gets sent up to the to the deputies in our office as well as myself. And then what we want to do is we want to take those recordings and share them with law enforcement to say, is this something that was fully warranted? Then we discuss it. If it's something that was a little bit excessive, then we have to deal with training. If it was excessive where it's beyond what's appropriate, then maybe we need to discipline this individual. And if it's excessive to the point that it is not lawful, then we need to separate ourselves from these individuals. Because my approach on law enforcement and excessive use of force is almost like domestic violence. The first time somebody in an intimate relationship puts their hands on somebody else, they are very remorseful. They understand that that was not the right thing to do, and they feel really bad. The second time, they really feel bad and they're apologetic. The third time, they have to reconcile for themselves why they're doing it. And it can't be that they are bad. It has to be because people are doing this, right? They have to justify it. And we as a community have to say, though, it's not justified. How do we help you? How do we counsel you? How do we teach you? How do we reteach you? And then also, how do we work within the community to make sure that we are not placing law enforcement in danger so that they're always feeling as if they are one incident short of being harmed themselves. So we all have to participate in that solution by controlling our actions. But we have to be part of that conversation, because if we are not, then honestly, there's nothing to stop from an incident like that happening in Loudoun County. We are very fortunate. Loudoun is a very safe community. But that's all the more reason why we have to invest our time and our money in being able to do the right thing. Chief Brown was talking about defunding the police, that's not really the right approach. I hate that phrase, defunding the police, because it basically makes it sound like we're shutting them down and we're not going to have law enforcement. That's not what that phrase means. It does mean reallocating resources. So hopefully what we do is we take some of that responsibility away from law enforcement to be the babysitter, to be the parent enforcer, to be the person who knocks on a door in a home so that they could tell the kid they have to go to school, or is working with the mental health cases or the drug addictions. That's a lot of responsibility put on law enforcement, but that's where our society is. We call the police for everything. Look at the Karen videos. Somebody has a lemonade stand, we call the police. Are you effing kidding me? That's like craziness. But we do. We default to calling the police for everything. We can't put them in that situation. Police should be used to police the community. If there's a law that's being broken, then that is what we should be using them for. But they can't be our healers for all that ails us. That's just not appropriate. So we have to reallocate what our expectations are, so that we are using them appropriately, and we're training them as we need to and supporting them as we need to. They are a significant part of our community, and we have to make sure we see that as being their role.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great, very, very insightful answer. Another great question. Sophia said, I was wondering whether the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office has a relationship with ICE, and if so, what is that relationship like?
I have not had any conversations with ICE since I've taken office. So is there a relationship? It might be a blind date, I don't know, but it's not one that's that we actually have or we engage in. I'll tell you what my position is on ICE. I am very concerned with some communities who report certain situations to ICE, because I think what it does is it has a more global chilling effect. I don't want anybody in my community to be fearful of calling law enforcement if they're undocumented, because then they're going to come into my house and they can take me from my kids, or they can take my parents from me. And therefore, instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sit here and continue to be victimized. That's a crazy position to put anybody in our community. Documentation or not documentation, you should never, ever have to suffer being a victim. And that is the position that we in my office take as far as making sure that we are protecting our community. Same thing about documentation or lack of documentation, status, financial, or anything else like that. That should not be a consideration as to how we are able to protect you or afford you protections. But short answer, no, we don't have a relationship with ICE.
Thank you. Sophia also asked another question, and this kind of goes into what we were talking about earlier with Chief Brown. She said, have there been any instances when law enforcement officers in Loudoun have been disciplined or let go due to use of excessive force?
So I have to go back 27 years, and I'm trying to see whether or not we've had that. So I'm going to answer that question anecdotally. So not as Commonwealth's attorney, because for that answer, I have to say to you that I'm not aware of any. But again, that's from the position of Commonwealth's attorney, that's only been since January. So I don't know historically if they've participated in that. I can tell you from a case that I personally handled, and this was maybe about 10 years ago, where a law enforcement officer did stop an individual. I think it was racial profiling. The situation escalated, and luckily for the person who was the citizen, he also came from a background of law enforcement. He was a federal agent. So that gave him a lot of credibility as to what occurred. This was also pre a lot of video. So we didn't have a lot of video. We had some dash cam recordings. But my understanding is from that case, that person was terminated. But that's, there are not many. And I will also say to you from my position as a Commonwealth attorney, we do have some incidents where we are in the process of working with their supervisors and us raising concerns about the amount of force or the escalation in cases that are taking place in Loudoun.
If you don't mind, Grace, I'm just going to interject real quick. Hi, I'm Nikita. I was talking earlier. I think you might have missed me, but it's nice to meet you. Nice to see you here. I did have a quick question for you. I posed a similar question to Chief Brown, but I wanted to ask you, like, how the Black Lives Matter movement has impacted the way that you engage in your work. Like, have you been able to do any demands for criminal justice reform in your work? And if so, like, do you mind detailing?
Yes. For starters, one is I'm going to change the root part of it to not being just Black Lives Matter, right? But it's criminal justice reform globally. Because I think with Black Lives Matter, what has happened has been more on the focus of law enforcement and how law enforcement engages with our Black and Brown community members. So I'm going to expand on that to criminal justice reform. Being in this position, I have the ability to have a platform to work with individuals who are in our General Assembly on the state level and to guide them and assist them in what changes we can see as a community and the types of offenses that come before the courts, the decriminalization of marijuana, trying to work with expungements of cases and non-convictions. Those are the individuals who've been charged with crime but were found either not guilty or their charge was dismissed from a decision by the prosecution to not prosecute. Trying to work with probation so that we have shorter terms of probation so that people are not on this long period that they end up coming back and being violated for minor offenses. So we've had a great ability to be able to actually have a voice and have somebody listening to us as prosecutors to make those changes in that direction versus what it used to be in the past, which is, can we make the punishment harsher? Can we have mandatory minimums for certain offenses? All these things that really were intended to weaponize certain offenses against our communities. And what we've done in this position is through having a voice with the prosecutors, we're able to actually have people listen to us as to what needs to be changed to make our communities better. I am a member of one of, I think, 12 individuals who are Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice. And that's what we've done is taken that platform to say is how do we move that conversation further so that we're also able to hold law enforcement accountable. And this is what I mean by accountable. If any of you saw the video with George Floyd, and I've said this on a couple other situations where, and I still feel this way, but I don't know who I'm more pissed at. Is it George Floyd? I'm not George Floyd, I'm sorry, Mr. Chauvin, the officer, or the other 3 officers who were around him and didn't stop him. And I'm still conflicted because I think there has to be an expectation that if we see somebody doing something wrong, that we have to help them do the right thing, even if it is somebody with a uniform. So what we've been trying to do with the legislature right now is to create a duty that is punishable, that the law enforcement officers have a duty to intercede or intervene if there is excessive force being used. Because I think what that does is that takes that concern that we have that where somebody's jumping in into something that they're just kind of following the lead, but now they have to have the independent thought that, wait a second, I have an obligation, a lawful obligation, that I have to protect somebody, even if it is against somebody that's on my team as a law enforcement officer from doing something excessive. So yeah, we've been very active in trying to make sure that we use this position to make better changes for our community.
So we're gonna have, oh wait, Sophia has a question. Okay, so what continued efforts are you making to keep jail populations low during COVID? It's a great question.
It is an excellent question. And I have to, again, remember we're talking about certain statements that sound like it's crazy, but it'll make some sense in a minute. One of the positive things that has happened for criminal justice reform actually has been as a result of COVID, because our criminal justice system has been very focused on using jail and prisons as the default consequence to a criminal act. And because of COVID, our judges are not defaulting to that. Our magistrates are not locking people up pre-trial, that means when they've been charged, and holding them in jail for extended periods of time while they await trial. So these are things that have changed the lens on how we treat our jails for purposes of incarceration. So what has our office done? Our office has been very aggressive in making sure that we're not using what we call secured bonds or cash bonds as a means to distinguish who gets to get out of jail and who gets to stay in jail pending a trial. So we're literally effectively using the code, which says if somebody is a unreasonable risk to the community or themselves, or a risk of flight, then they should be locked up. That's the best standard ever, right? It shouldn't be, well, I don't know if you can afford to, spend $5,000 bond, and that will be a condition as to why you come back to court. We don't have a lot of people who fail to come to court. The majority of the individuals who get charged come back to court to handle their business. So that cash bond really was only working to keep people who were less financially stable in jail while they were waiting their court date. And while they were there, they were losing their jobs, they were losing their housing. So that created further dysfunction or instability in their lives. And what I want our office to always have the reputation for is that what we're going to do is we are going to handle the business of the office by addressing what the behavior was and the act that was committed. We're not going to try to leverage the system to get you to plead guilty because you need to go home. And if that means you accept a charge that you're not guilty of just to make sure that you get to go home, we're not doing that. So those are things that we've changed how we do the front side of it. The other thing is we're not defaulting to jail for punishment. When I came into this office and as a defense attorney, I've seen cases like that, but I had one come across my desk here where for underage possession of alcohol in the past, the prosecutors were given a 12-month suspended sentence. Well, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but that person then does something like either test positive for use of marijuana, excessive speeding where they're reckless driving or something like that. It's a low-level offense. Then they're coming back before the court, and the prosecutors are saying, now lock them up for 12 months. And you're like, wait a second, 12 months for what? It was underage possession of alcohol. Is that a 12-month case? No. But because we were defaulting in the past to those types of sentences, we had approximately 420-something people in jail at the beginning of the year. We right now are down to about 240. And our community, knock on wood, is still very safe. So what we're realizing is jail is not the answer. We can't incarcerate ourselves out of problems, so we have to address the problems. But hence where the COVID influence has been positive to show us that we can keep people out of jail, we can consequence them, we can put limitations on them, and it does not make our community less safe.
I did want to say, everyone, again, we post all of these speeches online. So every single speaker that we have had is on our YouTube channel, which we're going to post later. But I implore all of you, and you're already here, so you're taking the first step, to please consider other perspectives. Right, we've had the great opportunity to speak with two wonderful individuals today, and that's been amazing. But there are so many other individuals that we've had speak, small Black business owners in the community. Johanna last week gave a great speech about allyship. Our first session had, like 64 attendees for a TikTok star. We've had everyone from, every single demographic physically possible, and we hope to continue to support diverse voices in the Black community. surrounding the Black civil rights crisis right now. So I just wanted to thank you all so much for being here. This project has been a huge deal to Nikita, Grace, Roma, and I, as well as Loudoun now. I'm gonna let Nikita conclude, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone. But yeah, Nikita, take it away.
Thank you so much again, Buta, for being here. And I know Chief Brown is gone, but I did want to thank him as well. And that's all for today. Thank you for being here, and I hope everyone has a good one. Stay safe.
Can I make a comment before you guys shut down?
Yeah, go ahead.
You guys are all awesome. Because by having these conversations and these opportunities, honestly, is where the change gets affected. And the coolest thing in the world is that we have a great community, and our community is rising to this challenge. And then just as importantly, we're challenging others to rise with us. So, kudos to you guys. Thank you very much for being interested and being engaged. And we're going to make a big difference, but it will only be with your support and your efforts. So thank you.